Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk, which I hope will be inspiring, and then you will have a few take-home messages. So the title of my talk is Food Production, Natural Ecosystems Restoration, and Climate Change Mitigation. I've mostly worked in Africa, on the African continent, so most of the case studies I will be presenting come from this continent, but obviously the case studies can be replicated and rolled out to other continents as long as the context is suitable. I will just start with, yes, just a small introduction about me. So I have a background in plant biology and in forest ecology. I have coordinated for a few years biodiversity information projects around ex situ seed conservation, mostly to try to save floras of Europe, so native plants, especially the critically endangered ones. And then I moved on more to a role into management and coordination of restoration projects in Africa, in both Western and Eastern Africa, mostly the restoration of highly degraded landscapes. And those projects were really about trying to have a win-win-win solution, both in terms of restoring the biodiversity, as well as the ecosystem services, which is underpinned by biodiversity, but also to try to improve communities, which livelihoods, which very much depend on this biodiversity and ecosystem services, as well as trying to mitigate and adapt to the effect of climate change. Currently, I'm based in the Netherlands. I work for a reforestation company, and I mostly work for the restoration and the reforestation of a forest reserve in Ghana, across 5,000 hectares. Just as a summary, in a nutshell, I've worked with many different stakeholders throughout my career, both companies, governmental agencies, mainly forestries, NGOs, local communities, the civil society in general. So my approach for dealing and managing with those projects has very much been into trade-offs and also participation and understanding of all the interests of those stakeholders so that the projects can be successful. So the content of my talk will be in three parts. I'll first talk about a general overview of food production and food security and the challenge they represent and how the different sustainable development goals are interlinked towards delivering these food production security aspects. I'll try to give you in another part real examples, concrete examples of the projects that I've been dealing in order to really combine different SDGs and to deliver outputs. Then I will conclude by explaining what could be a roadmap to what I think is, based on my experience in the different projects I've managed, what I think is the best approach, landscape approach to reconcile different objectives which may be competing each other. So let me start by this very global introduction, because probably you have heard about the 2021 IPBES IPCC workshop report that came out a few months ago, that was produced by a range of experts and scientists and really describe the state of the world, both in terms of biodiversity, ecosystem services, but also in terms of climate change effects and the different scenarios that we are going to be exposed on. It's very interesting that for the first time it was a joint workshop, a joint report, because usually those big international panels work separately. And for the first time this year, they've produced a common report, which is indeed promising, and they should continue producing these joint conclusions. So mainly the main report and the main conclusion for this report is that it's not very surprising, but we are experiencing a collapse of biodiversity, a collapse of ecosystems and all the services they provide. There is a special worry about the level of degradation of ecosystems, because instead of capturing carbon, they instead release it instead of storing it. And the bad management practices we have, especially around agricultural practices, are making the environment and the food security at stake, especially because of pollution, because of pesticides, which also make our soil less productive. But in parallel, as you can see, it's also the decade of the UN ecosystem restoration. So we are right in the beginning of this decade. It started in 2021 and in 2030. And this initiative really aims to protect and sustainably manage and restore ecosystems in order to deliver a range of outputs and a range of services and benefits, including the ones on biodiversity that were described in the previous report, as well as trying to adapt and mitigate the effect of climate change. So I'm going to talk about especially agro-food systems. So please don't get me wrong. I know that agriculture is very important, and I know it's essential. So don't get me wrong that the fact that I might have a very critical view on agriculture, but it's not the case. It's just a situation which is reflected in the different data I'm going to show you. I know agriculture is very important. It contributes to a massive part of the GDP in many countries. Actually, a third of the world of people actually depend on agriculture for their livelihoods, either because they depend on subsistence farming, so really daily production of food in order to feed, or larger farming exploitation. But in any case, the agri-food systems in general is both causing huge challenges, but also is facing huge challenges at the same time. So that's what we are going to go through in this first part of my presentation. Just a few figures to start off. So the 2021 report of the FAO, so the food branch of the United Nations, it showed that there has been an increase actually in 2020, of the number of people who are facing hunger. So depending on how you consider what is extreme hunger or moderate hunger, still there are some variation between 720 or 811 million people facing hunger. And this has been a sharp increase from the year before, 2019. So the pandemic can be partly responsible for this sharp increase. But not only that, especially as we will see in the presentation, effect of climate change are making the scenario and the situation worse. In parallel, and paradoxically, it's also important to mention that there are also more and more people suffering from obesity, bad diets, which is a result from the food industry and the kind of products and the kind of transformed food that easily accessed and that people can feed on. Just to show you a summary and a breakdown per continent. So we've had a sharp increase of food insecurity since 2014, as I mentioned, around 30% increase of the world population. But as you see, depending on, again, if you consider severe food insecurity or the moderate one, the situation is not the same per continent. As you see, the situation of the world is indeed an increase, but Africa in general is the worst affected continent, as well as Asia and Latin America. And this trend is increasing and is probably going to be on the same sort of status quo and same scenario if no actions and urgent actions, as mentioned in those previous reports, are undertaken. So from food security to climate change, obviously you are very well aware about the last UN COP26 in Glasgow on climate change, where bad practices and unsustainable practices have been highlighted once again for the release of greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously agriculture is one of them. And also, as you know, that more and more people, including young people, including a famous one that you probably all know, are pushing for actions on climate change. So the result of that is, and the main question, which is indeed very relevant, is how can we achieve food security while at the same time adapting to climate change, but also having all those activities, sustainable activities for farming, for producing food, that are going to reduce gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, in order to fulfill the different targets and also the different national contributions that each countries have decided to have contributed to and are voluntarily contributed to in order to reduce their emissions. So, as you know, agri-food systems in climate change are very well interlinked and very much interlinked. Agriculture and as, let's say, a global land use aspects, all the activities around agriculture are the main drivers of the environmental change on the planet, which could be just a conversion of land, of natural land, or the very practices that are being run into an agricultural plot, which would be then responsible for the release of greenhouse gas. So depending on where you are on the globe, it's actually pretty much the same situation. It could be, as you see on the bottom right photo, slash and burn activities in Madagascar, which is actually the normal practice, the current practice. It's basically burning remnants of forests in order to gain access and to increase and encroach the agricultural patches. And these practices are actually very unsustainable because the simple fact of burning the landscape is going to release a lot of nutrients which are actually not going to be assimilated by plants. And that's why it's going to cause erosion at the same time. This is why every 2 or 3 years, farmers have to expand their activities and again slash and burn new parts of the forest in order to keep farming, because their current or their previous farms would be unsustainable for farming. This obviously releases a lot of greenhouse gas, and the situation is pretty much the same in terms of emissions in more industrialized countries. In the top right image, where intensive farming, industrialized farming, is also responsible for a massive amount of greenhouse gas emission into the atmosphere, including CO2, obviously, but also methane, which is a more potent gas which is released in the atmosphere, and that this kind of agricultural or intensive agricultural practices contribute to. So overall, it's about a third of the greenhouse gases which are emitted come from those agricultural practices. It's important that I'm going to just to give you two sentences about the Glasgow Climate Pact that was decided a few days ago, because the party recognized obviously that in order to stay within the 1.5 degrees, we need to implement a rapid and deep reduction of those GHG. If not only CO2, which is estimated at 45% by 2030, but also other GHG gas, which the parties are actually a bit vague about that because it's deep reductions. I'm not too sure what it means, but we know that this has to be done very quickly and in a massive way. So we've seen that agriculture is actually a big contributor to climate change, but at the same time, this sector is also the most vulnerable to climate change. As I mentioned earlier, in the case of Madagascar, we can see that these are not sustainable practices, but more worryingly, especially in the tropics, farming conditions have become very unpredictable. It could they vary from weather extremes. There could be droughts with not a single drop of rain throughout a whole year, or floods or storms. It makes the yields and the productivities very uncertain, with all the consequences this can have, especially in terms of mass migration of people that can't even feed anymore, try to migrate to different countries where life seems to be better. It's the same also, obviously, near the coast, in the coastal lands, because of the increase, the rising of the sea levels. As you know, these are going to convert those coastal lands into wetlands, which we are not, and they won't be able to be farmed anymore. And we also experience an increase of a lot of pests and vectors, borne disease, especially to cattle, which come from different zones and different warmer zones. And this also affects the production and the productivity of the farms, especially the annual yields. And that has to force farmers to adopt new practices. So either they've had time to lead a transition into their farming practices, hopefully, but if not, then they have to either change their livelihood or, as I said, migrate. Again, the second part of the Glasgow Climate Pact mentions something which is essential, which is key, because the parties mention again the urgency to finance and to achieve a technology transfer and a capacity building to do exactly that, to do this transition so that we can switch and we can have a better and more sustainable way of farming, and in order to avoid all the damages that are going to be linked to climate change, so that we can better prepare through the transition to via financing, technology transfer, and capacity building in order for the farmers and the agricultural sector in general to adapt to those conditions. So the positive thing in all this is actually the agricultural sector has a significant potential to contribute to the climate goals. As I'm going to mention throughout my different concrete examples, and also from what you've probably heard during lectures or during conferences, there are different approaches which are sustainable that you've probably heard about, including climate smart agricultures or agroforestry. But these may take a long time to be implemented, but these also represent a transformation in the agri-food systems in general. So this transformation, which I mentioned, as you know, agriculture started a long time ago. You know that before we were hunter-gatherers, so basically we were human beings were feeding on what actually should be the normal diet of human beings, which are nuts and berries and fruits. Occasionally, you might find a piece of meat or some fish to feed on, or maybe some eggs. But that would be really, really rare, and it would be just once in a while. These are basically our natural diet and our previous diet a long time ago. And obviously, since the adoption or the creation, let's say, of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent and in Mesopotamia, so currently the Middle East at the moment. We have started to domesticate both cattle and crops so that we don't need to go and forage for our food as the hunters gatherers were doing, but we can actually have them wherever we want to grow them or to raise them. And obviously throughout centuries, trade selections and hybridizations has led us to improve our food, bigger fruits, more tasty food, more nutritious food, up until about the first steps of the mechanization, where culture has become more like business, where we can actually use the soil as a support to actually start to produce money and to produce big quantities of food and and start to achieve huge incomes from big agro companies. This has lasted until around the 50s, the 60s, which the so-called Green Revolution that has able to produce a lot of food very quickly based on fertilizers, based on chemicals that are actually the results. Most of them are the results and the outputs of the Second World War, because we invented new chemical components and new chemical products that were actually became useless at the end of the war. And then we found a use for them in our fields, in our crop fields, in order to fight the pests and also to make them, to grow them faster by using chemical fertilizers. But as I said, this model so far, at least in the industrial world, is no longer suitable. And we need to think about a transformation of the system. So what should be this transformation of agricultural system? Well, we know it's urgent, but we know also that this transformation should tackle three main pillars, three main areas, which is really around the social inclusion, because it should be gender transformative, inclusive and proper, inclusive of the role of stakeholders that would be affected by this transformation, and also target especially the very, very small holders which do only subsistence farming. It should also harness energies between climate change adaptation and mitigation, so that the environment is both not affected, but also agriculture itself does not depend on the fluctuation of extreme weather, as I mentioned before, and to make sure that humanity is well fed. This food should also be nutritious. When I'm talking about nutritious, it could be staple food, fruits and vegetables, which is very well understood to be the basis in many projects that I've worked on in Africa. So you see a lot of people only producing very healthy, actually, and very nutritious food. But this should be, which is very balanced and healthy. But this should probably be the way that we should try to promote healthy food, by producing even more of these and distribute it through markets, and which should also be very accessible and for not a lot of money, so that people can afford that. So probably you see where I'd like to get to with this introduction, is that those three pillars actually are very much embedded into the Sustainable Development Goals that I'm sure you know of, so I'm not going to spend time explaining them. But what I'll do is actually spend some time on three of them, which is SD2, 13, 14, and 15, because my role and my different professional experiences have really been around working towards the outputs and delivering the outputs of SDG 15, but SDG 15 is actually cannot work on its own, and it relies on the other outputs of other SDGs. So let me start with SDG 2, which, as you know, is end hunger, achieve food security, and achieve improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture, especially when we have to feed 8 billion by 2030, and especially in a high-level climate change scenario, let's say. SDG2 also, like the other SDGs, as you know, have specific targets and indicators, so I'm not going to explain them. But just very quickly, if you are interested in what is happening and what is going on with and what we are doing towards the completion of these SDGs by 2030, if you go on the United Nations website and the 17 SDG goals, you will see that on top of the targets, you will see that there are a lot of actions. In this case, for SDG2, there are 777 actions. And if you click on them, you can actually have a breakdown of all the actions which are implemented in order to try to deliver the outputs of SDG2. And which is very interesting is that you can actually break down by regions. So depending on where you are, our projects you may be running or will be running in a specific country, you can actually see what is going on in this very specific region, or in this very specific country. And also you can break down by or select by entity types, which is very interesting if you work in a governmental sector, in a company, in an NGO, or in a university or in a research group. So it's also very much tailored by the type of activities you can run within your own institution and see what you can or maybe not can try to achieve to do. As I mentioned, I worked a lot on SDG 15, a bit also regarding the mangrove on SDG 14. SDG 14 is really conserve, sustainably use all the marine resources for sustainable development. SDG 15 is to protect and restore and sustainably use the terrestrial land use and avoid and also combat desertification and reduce degradation, forest loss, or any other kind of biodiversity loss. So again, those activities, those goals have their own targets and indicators, which I mentioned. But the last one I'd like to mention is that SDG 13, which is to take an urgent action to combat climate change and its impact with its own target, is actually probably the one that is going to govern and to control the rest of the SDGs. Because as long as we won't be able to achieve SDG 13, the outputs of the other SDGs are going to be very much unlikely and very what is going to be extremely hard to achieve and deliver the outputs of the other SDGs. So to produce food into the future, which is SDG 2, obviously the transformative approach, the transformative model that I've presented you earlier, need to adopt sustainable practices in order to deliver of SDG 14, 15. And for this, the only way I've seen and tried to implement in my projects is really to protect the ecosystem services, to make the production systems resilient, and also to protect livelihoods and ensure food security. So as I mentioned before, without good outputs for SDG 13, the other SDGs are going to be very much compromised. But let's assume that SDG 13 is going to be okay. Let's assume that we are going to achieve something and deliver some outputs for it. Let's just focus on these other SDGs 2, 14 and 15, because actually they may look antagonist. They may look like they oppose each other, but is it really the case, or is it not possible then to deliver outputs which are combined? So that's going to be the end of my introduction. I just would like to show you one of the project that I worked on. I'm currently working on. It's in Ghana. It's a mangrove, or what used to be a mangrove, or what is left of a mangrove, as you can see on the left-hand side. It's actually what we call a white mangrove. It's a kind of mangrove. And on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you can see how much degraded this has been. It has been burnt for different reasons, for cattle grazing, for food production. But for me, this is very much what is at the border between the different SDGs when it comes to food production, when it comes to SDG 15, the sustainable use of land, as well as SDG 14, because as I'm going to explain to you later, mangroves is actually the cradle of fish or crustacean that fishermen are going to fish later on when those juvenile fish have become more mature and they've reached the deep sea, and then they're going to be able to feed them. But this is very much the kind of habitat and ecosystem which is very, very fragile, which is very, very at risk. And I think the challenge here to complete or to deliver some of the outputs of the SDGs really can be explained with this whole picture, because there are so many challenges and so many interests from different stakeholders that finding the right solution for restoring the habitat while providing food for the villages around, as well as the fishermen, is really essential. So I'm going to talk about the second part of talk, which is going to list and overview some of the different solutions that I've mentioned in order to make the ecosystem, the agricultural or agri-food system more resilient, as well as to protect the ecosystem services that are needed to achieve food security. The first thing I'd like to talk about is climate smart agriculture, because climate smart agriculture, as you have heard, is a great opportunity to improve sustainable agriculture. There are many examples around the world that have already been implemented or being implemented, and you can find the list of them in this report, which has been produced by the FAO on case studies in 2021. So I won't have the time to go through them, but I invite you to read them. There are also very good examples from the World Bank where you can make those CSA food system very, very optimum and efficient with precision agriculture, as is in the case in Morocco, which promotes agroecology, and also in Niger with the distribution of selected drought tolerances because of the drought that they are currently experiencing in Niger. You will have a talk, I think it's tomorrow, with Joseph, that is based in Niger, and he probably is going to tell you about it much more. But just be aware that these CSA activities are very much currently implemented in Niger, in the surrounding countries as well. What is important to remember with climate smart agriculture is that it's very context specific. It means that a solution that you might have area or even in a village or in a particular place in the country may not be reproducible, may not be replicated 20 or 30 kilometers away, because you really need to analyze it and you really need to understand the local context. So CSA is based on 3 pillars. You need obviously to keep increasing agricultural productivity. You need to make sure you maintain a yield which is high enough to feed populations, but at the same time you need to adapt your food system to your agri-food systems to climate change effects, and also you need to reduce, avoid as much as possible greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to explain to you very quickly what are the main pillars of the CSA. Then I'm going to give you some examples based on my previous and current work. First of all, you need to have to expand the evidence. It means that you need to understand in your local situation what's the effect of the climate change on food productions, what are the threats, how your production is going to be affected, and how much vulnerable it is to the effect of climate change. And you need to understand what are going to be the triggers, both institutional and also financial, in order to deliver the CSA objectives that you would like to have. But for this, you first need a big policy framework that are going to be within each country that needs to support your CSA activities. so that they are really included into policy documents and policy frameworks. You may actually have to modify the policies in order to include those CSA because they may be completely inexisting or they may be outdated. You will need to update them as soon as possible, depending on the context. And you also need to express a deep collaboration exercise or to run a collaboration exercise between the different institutions of your country or your locality who are in charge of all those sectors for agriculture, for climate change adaptation, for climate change mitigations, and for food security. Obviously, capacity building is going to be necessary because these institutions may not be aware of CSA techniques or policies of legislations. So the national policymakers, as well as the institutions, need to be trained and need to be informed about what are the decisions and the next steps in order to deliver CSA goods. The other point is obviously, as I mentioned in the next step of my slide, the financial arm, the financial mechanism is indeed essential. You really need to find the leverage, you need to find the triggers through different funds, which may be international, like the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environmental Facility, in order to inject money and invest into CSA practices, both in the public or the private sector, in the country or in the regions that you are going to work on, in order to integrate CSA into the agri-food planning of the regions that you are going to work on. And obviously the last aspect is going to implement those policies at the field level, at the local community level, at a smallholder level. So you will have to select, you have to make participate those people, those local farmers who are keen to adapt those new CSA farming practices, but also, again, you will have to probably train them, build their capacity in order for them to make sure that they will adhere to the CSA principles and deliver on the outputs. I would like now to show you an example offer that I've run in the Sahel. The project is called Great Green Wall. So it's GGW stands for Great Green Wall. Sahel is one of the world's poorest region. It has experienced desertification for decades. Desertification is not because of the expansion of the Sahara Desert in the north, but it's also a combination with unsustainable land management. Sustainable land management came from overexploitation of the land, basically over-farming and overgrazing, as well as charcoal production, which has basically depleted the resources and then led to the dramatic consequence that we are experiencing now. What we've seen in 2017 is that 20 million of people in the Horn of Africa had to migrate. We're on the verge of starvation and had to migrate. Many more millions aim to migrate because of the instability of the region. More worryingly is that the population there is going to triple by more than triple by 2050. And more worryingly is that we will have to give jobs to young people in order for them to stay in the areas, in order to be able to have a living, in order to be able to have a minimum socioeconomic livelihood, in order to make them continue to live in these areas. So these problems, obviously, of climate change, desertification, pose serious threats to agricultural productivity, as well as quality of life, as I mentioned, but also food insecurity. So to address this problem, the Great Green Wall initiative was launched in 2007. across a range of countries from Senegal to Djibouti. It covers around 150 million hectares, and it was led by the African Union. The aim is to restore around 8,000 kilometers wall across the width of Africa. It's not really a wall, it's more like a mosaic and patches of different plots, but still obviously along the Sahel. And it's a very good way also to show that different countries can collaborate, different communities can collaborate, to show that there is solidarity and collaborations between different countries to try to tackle the problem of desertification of these countries. Just a few examples of what has been achieved so far. Just to give you an example, Ethiopia has managed to restore 15 million hectares, which is very good. Most other countries have managed to do so, but there are challenges because of funding gaps, because the money does not trickle down from the African Union and the other intergovernmental bodies into the people that are going to implement the work, especially the local communities. We have weak structures in place in most of the African countries in order to use this money to deliver and to implement the restoration work, from the seedling production down to the management of the site. And the coordination is also something that is lacking at a regional or national level, especially when you consider that those countries are in the conflict zones. So the goals by 2030 are huge, especially when you think about restoring 100 million hectares and sequester 200 million tons of carbon and create 10 million green jobs. And it's estimated that $33 billion would need further $33 billion needs to be put and injected into the model in order for it to run. It's not about just growing trees. There are many, many more aspects into social livelihoods that is going to be represented, that not only land restoration, but also climate resilient infrastructure and the local socio-economic livelihoods that is going to be promoted and supported by this project. Tree plantation is one thing, but it's not the only one, because techniques are very diverse. So one of them, which I worked on in Niger, is actually farm managed natural regeneration, where basically the farmer himself is going to assist the regeneration of trees within its plots, because it provides him with benefits, with ecosystem services that his crops depend on. It could be shade, it could be retention of water, or it could be supply of fruits or fodder for his livestock. So by systematically pruning the roots and the stems, so basically by coppicing the trees, those trees are going to be stronger and create those shapes that the farmer is going to use for feeding his cattle or for feeding, producing food on his plot. The very good the pros for this approach is really that it's low cost, that it's very easy to do, and it's also easily to it's possible to disseminate the knowledge from one farmer to the other. The other technique that I've worked on in the Great Green Wall, especially in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Niger, is the half moon. So half moon is really to store water just before rainy season, so that it can grow. It can keep some moisture in the wells long enough for vegetation to grow. It could be herbaceous vegetation so that the cattle can feed on, but it can also be small trees that you want to plant in or around the half moon, so that the chance of survival is increased throughout the dry season. A similar thing is done by farmers in their plots. It's what they call zais. Zais are just a learning from experience approach. They are holes which are dug in the ground during the rainy season. Well, the big one and the small one, because we have two rainy seasons in this part of the world. And they hold water for a period of time which is long enough so that the crops can survive the dry spell. They do that also with stone lines. So basically they dig, you see on the photo, they build long stones so that erosion of soil is reduced because of the storms, because of the wind, so that you can keep the top layer of the soil in your farm so that the productivity and the fertility of the soil is maintained and can continue having decent yields throughout the growing season. Another example, which is to me one of the most successful, is agroforestry. Agroforestry is an association between trees and crops. So sometimes, again, between of these, this sort of competition between SDG 2 and SDG 15, we can think that this is not compatible to produce food while maintaining and restoring land use. Actually, it is possible if you select the right trees or if you select the right crops. This example is in Burkina Faso. By growing Federbia. Federbia is a leguminosy species. So basically what it does, it absorbs nitrogen from the atmosphere and converts it into organic nitrogen that is used by the plant as a fertilizer in order for it to grow. So all the leguminosy species do that. But what is very interesting with Federbia is that it creates cooler conditions in this part of the world, in this part of the Sahel, so that the temperatures are cooler for crops to grow, in this case maize, and also the fertility of the soil can let other crops like millet, so basically cereals crops, grow as an intercropping along the leaves, along the trees, the individuals of Federbia. This is just one example. There are many other examples of intercropping of crops and trees that you would have carefully selected before, because you know that they are going to provide a lot of ecosystem services, fertilization, maintenance of water, and also shade, so that the crop can go through the dry season, deliver a yield which is high enough for the local communities to feed on and to sell. The Great Green Wall has also targeted in the species that it has used throughout the width of Africa. Some of the species which are very famous to produce what we call non-timber forest products, use the term NTFPs, it's what it's called. NTFPs are useful foods, substances, which are collected from forests, but they are non-timber. So basically you would collect anything else but the timber, so that you basically leave the tree alive, leave the tree standing up, but you would collect any other part of the trees to make something, to transform it and to make a living out of it. You know one of it, which is honey. Forest honey is very much produced in Africa. It's something that you can also sell at a premium, at a more higher price. So have organic forest honey, which you can sell at a premium. I will go through a list of NTFPs that I've worked on later, but for the Great Green Wall project, we specially grew two kinds of trees. One is Acacia Senegal, which you may not know, but actually what you've done is you've probably used it or drinked it, because Acacia Senegal produced what we call gum arabic. And gum arabic is basically the sap of the tree. And it is used as a premium stabilizer, particularly in soft drinks, because it prevents the sugar from crystallizing in soft drinks, and especially Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola use a lot of Acacia Senegal. So you see, it's a very good way for local communities to harvest NTFP from the tree, so without killing the tree, so that they make an income to maintain the tree in the area with all the benefits it has in order for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, for climate change adaptation and mitigation, because those trees are very well adapted to dry conditions. So it has a high demand from the communities. And as long as the supply chains, so for example, from the local communities up to Coca-Cola, is good and is respecting or is paying enough the local communities so that they get a fair share for their yield, they will keep continuing. They will keep harvesting, planting, maintaining, and harvesting the product of Acacia silicon. Same thing for another tree that I've worked on that you probably know, or at least you've probably heard about, is the baobab. The baobab is a widely distributed tree. Is this one, it's Andansonia digitata, so you have different species of baobab, but this one especially is very widely distributed across Africa. It is used for many things by the local communities. The food pulp, it's actually very high and very rich in C vitamin. The seeds, you can produce oil from the seeds. It's also used in traditional medicine, and it's also a tree which is very good because it is it has a spiritual connotation. So a lot of spiritual beliefs exist around the trees. So it benefits from a sort of protection status because basically people don't want to cut it because they think like spirits or ancestors live in the tree, so that it has gained a specific status. So it's good that it is somehow protected so it can still deliver its NTFPs. I'm going to tell you about two more NTFPs that I worked. One is in Morocco. It's the argan oil. I'm sure that you've heard already about the argan oil. The argan oil comes from a tree which is called Argania spinosa. It grows in one specific biosphere reserve, a UNESCO biosphere reserve. It's endemic to the southwest of Morocco. And it is essential for not only the livelihoods, but also of local communities that I'm going to show you next, but also to prevent the encroachment from the Sahara Desert, because it's a natural barrier, like a green barrier, same as you saw on the Great Green Wall side, and to stop the Sahara to expand more northward. So the argan oil, which is again produced by local communities and sold even at a premium price, is a good way for the local communities to keep planting, harvesting, managing and harvesting the oil and keep this natural barrier. It plays a very big role in women's cooperative, generates about more than 5,000 tons of oil per year. So women work in the cooperatives and they have a share of the sale of the oil. It's a very hard work. I've tried myself, it's very tough. You need to crack the nut to get the kernel you see on the top, on the bottom right photo. And these are those kernels that you're going to press in order to produce oil. And this cannot be done mechanically. You have to, extracting the kernel. They've tried to do it mechanically, but only human hands can do it, extract those kernels. As I mentioned just before, those are essentials to keep cooperatives up and running. All the benefits for combating the desert encroachment, but also for job creation. Another NTFP I'd like to show you is the butter, the shea butter. You've probably also heard of shea butter. It's widespread across the tropical Africa. You can also have agroforestry plots. On the left-hand side, you can also see that maize can be grown under this tree, which is called Vitellaria paradoxa. It's the shea butter tree. And here again is the women who are responsible for collecting the nuts, to dry them, to crack them open, and to extract the kernel. So same thing as for the argan oil. Then boil the water and then scoop up the butter which has been solidified. And then you probably know that this is sold as a very expensive cosmetics in the cosmetics industry, as skin moisturizer creams or hair conditioner or soaps or massage oil. It could also be used locally as a cooking oil or as a wax to make candles. And very interesting, it's also used as a substitute for cocoa butter. It has a more or less the same properties as the cocoa butter, and it could be added into the ingredients of cocoa. One last NTFP I'd like to show you, which I really like, is the tamarind, Timaris indica. It's not from India, it's actually really from Africa. And you can see that you can eat the pulp, the pods, the fruits, which are delicious, very sweet, full of vitamins, very nutritious. Kids love it. It's a very well adapted crop for the desert that you can use. It's not going to be harmed by climate change effects, and it's provide a very good livelihoods to communities again. There is a whole range of other NTFPs that I don't have time to go through now, but oils, nuts, gums, medical products, fungi as well, because fungi are depend on grow in symbiosis with trees, and they as long as you have trees, you will have the fruiting bodies of the mushrooms and the fungi that you will be able to sell. So keeping a forest cover is very important to have the production of fungi that are very specific to the trees, that they are in symbiosis with. One thing about NTFPs is that they also experience challenge. So I've shown you a very good picture, but obviously the NTFPs needs to access markets. You need to rely on sustainable and reliable supply chains. You need also to convince the local communities that they should produce NTFPs rather than using the timber for other purposes, basically charcoal or timbers, because obviously as soon as you will have cut down the tree, there will be no more NTFP. So it is very important to engage with the communities and build capacity and do some trainings. And also there is a time window, because obviously trees will take time to mature and to deliver the fruits. So it's very important that in the meantime, while the trees are growing and while they are going, before they are producing their fruits or their foods or their NTFPs, you need to find an alternative or a substitute for the communities to wait, providing them jobs and providing them alternative livelihoods so that they can wait until those trees are mature. Also, taxes and permits and licensing fees can also be a deterrent and may not be accepted by the community. So you need to find ways through NGOs or through governments so that taxes can be lower, or the governments can also take into account that the communities won't be able to sustain or to support those taxes and have a lower tax system for those NTFPs. As I mentioned, financing of the NTFP is mainly run by governments or NGOs, but sometimes microfinance can support. Small and medium enterprise can also help developing NTFPs. Again, tomorrow you will have a talk by Joseph in Niger. You will see that what he has done with his company, Sahara Sahel Food, which is very interesting. He's going to give you a very good case study on that. So I really encourage you to attend his lecture. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but just be aware that it is something that is being promoted by a small and medium enterprise. One thing I'd like to mention again about food security experience in Africa is that invasive alien species are very much a problem because they drop the yields. So you have loss of yields because of these invasive alien species that could be either animals or vegetables, plant species. One thing that these are examples of plants that I've come across in Africa. Prosopis on the top and Opuntia on the right. The problem is that once it's going to encroach in an area, in a farm area, or even in a forest, these are going to be extremely hard to get rid of. That represents a very big challenge in itself. They could also be poisonous to livestock, human. These are going to be a big challenge for the years to come. especially in the in the climate change situation where those species are going to be supported by the change of the habitat, especially the disturbance of the habitat will make them stronger and widespread much more. I'd like also to then also present solutions for the invasive alien species, because which is actually a win-win solution. There are some natural pesticides that we call pesticidal plants. You have to be aware that before the chemical industry, our ancestors used to use pesticidal plants, natural plants, in order to deter pests, and they were using parts of the plants that they know are very good for deterring the pests from eating the plants. And one good thing is actually you can use in a win-win solution an invasive alien species. In this case, is the neem. The picture is on the top, at the bottom left, which is a very big invasive tree in Africa, from South Asia. But because it has properties in its leaves that are very strong and very aggressive towards pests, you can actually extract components and solutions and produce solution and spray them on your field, on your crop. So this is completely natural. This does not use any chemical. Actually, it's also a very cheap way, because neem is everywhere, so local communities don't have to go and buy some chemicals. They also don't need to be exposed to the chemicals that may cause disease, cancer or immunology deficiencies by the fact of being overexposed to those kind of chemicals. And again, these are very simple solutions to replicate and to implement, as long as the knowledge, as long as the capacity is built in those communities, the knowledge is transferred, that they know which species to use and how to extract. But these are very sustainable approaches to sustainable food production and reducing the level of pesticides in crops. I'd like also to tell you a bit more what I've done for SDG 14. Basically, I've restored some mangroves towards Togo and towards Benin. Mangroves are essential for not only as a protection, as a barrier for against tides and against waves, especially in case of tsunamis or big storms, but in their root systems, they are actually holding, nesting a lot of juvenile fish, as I mentioned before, and those fish are going to go later to the high sea, where they're going to be fished by fishermen, and then they will support fisherman livelihood. So it's very important to keep those habitats in place. So you would actually be again at the front line between SDG 2, food production for the fishermen, SDG 14 in order to maintain the fish stocks, and SDG 15 because those are coastal forests which are essential for a range of benefits, including biodiversity conservation, because these are paradise for birds or turtles or primates that live on the beaches, and as well as a very good way to mitigate and adapt to climate change. You can actually have a look at this website, which is very good because it maps mangroves worldwide, so per countries, and it also shows you the capacity or the extension, the number of hectares you would be able to restore per country if you were going to develop a project with an NGO or with different governments. I'd like to conclude my talk by giving you a roadmap, which I think is the solution for me, because I've worked with different projects, I've worked with different stakeholders, and the interests are very varied. Sometimes they are conflicting. If you talk to a company, if you talk to a government, if you talk to a local community. But I think the best way to solve this is a trade-off, and it is a landscape approach. So Let me use. Sorry, I'm overrunning, but I'll try to be quick. Please give me maybe yeah, it's a bit less than 10 minutes to finish off. So land use obviously is something which is key as what we are going to use the land for. Obviously, agriculture has its own share of the land, but there are different non-agriculture communities that would like to access this land, including wood products or biofuels or mine resources, or even projects like the one that I'm currently working on, which is basically sequestrating carbon into the soil. So excluding agricultural practices, and we just want to have a carbon sink in the area, in the land that we would like to access. So obviously, these, as you can expect, might create conflicts between different goals, between different interests. And what has been developed is a land approach, which concept, which actually combine different objectives and goals together, which could be environment, which could be agriculture, and non-agriculture communities in a trade-off. So I really encourage you to read this article that really lists the different principles that are really underpinned below the land approach, where we are going to allocate land in order to achieve different social, economic, and environmental objectives. These are the 10 principles. I won't have the time to go through the 10s, but I'm just going to explain what to me are the 5 more important principles so that you can actually deliver on the range of projects that I've described before when you want to create NTFPs, or when you want to maintain livelihoods, or when you want to maintain forest cover or mangroves. You have to do this landscape approach first so that those projects can be successful. The first principle is a continual learning and adaptive management, because landscape processes are dynamic. As you saw on the photo I show you on the mangrove, which have been degraded on the right-hand side, but you still have a bit of mangrove left on the left-hand side. This evolves on an annual basis. So you really need to understand what are the underlying causes and effects and the change in the landscape, so that is going to inform decision making and improve the management of this area, so that you are going to take the best principles and the best approaches. And this is a fundamental principle that sometimes is overlooked when we set up projects. And I think it is very important to take time at the beginning to analyze what are the dynamics of the different social, economic aspects and environmental aspects, so that you can develop your project. An entry point as to, let's say, it's a common objective or entry point that has to be found, because negotiation and participation between the stakeholders. Let's say if I start to develop a forest in a plot of land that has been farmed, and then the farmers are not happy, they won't trust me. So trust is very important when you start developing such project on the landscape approach. And trust is only emerge when the objectives and the values are shared between the different stakeholders. So you have to be very transparent about what you would like to achieve, so that there is no surprise, there are no beefs about any unexpected outputs. But the values, the beliefs, and the objectives of this project has to be very clearly defined and explained to all the stakeholders, so that you can actually start developing trust and you can work towards different objectives. So as long as you won't have the trust and a shared between all the stakeholders and a shared vision between all the stakeholders, the landscape approach is going to fail and the project objectives are going to fail. It's pretty certain. As I mentioned before, landscape can be used for different uses and for different purposes. So in different ways by different stakeholders. So you need to be ready to compromise. You need to be ready to do a trade-off in order to, so all the uses, all the needs, and all the objectives of the projects can be reconciled, because if someone is too greedy and only wants his objective or her objective to be delivered because a project or a client or a grant or a funder says so, this is not going to work. You really need to adjust with the other people's need and come up to a compromise, come up to a trade-off, so that most of the objectives from most of the stakeholders will be met and will be already a very good success. So as I mentioned, multiple stakeholders' objectives can be assessed in different ways, but these have to come up. Means that all the stakeholders' decision have to be represented in a very equitable way, in a decision-sharing way, so that one is not underrepresented and the other one is not overrepresented. It should be a very equal and transparent activity that is to be run between all stakeholders. The last principle for me, is that resilience is something that we need to target in the end, because once you've developed a landscape approach between different land uses and between different stakeholders, you want that to last. You don't want someone or one of the projects to fail. So addressing the threats that are going to rise and are going to jeopardize a project is going to occur for sure. So improving the capacity of the projects, of the institutions, of the governments, of the stakeholders, of the local communities to resist to those threats and to respond to those threats in a very timely way, but also in a very prioritized way in order to assess what is priority number one that I have to assess or to tackle is essential. And again, training and capacity buildings of all those institutions, or governmental bodies, or NGOs, or local stakeholders, communities, is the key, so that when a threat is going to come up, it could be an invasive alien species, it could be a storm, it could be a drought, it could be a flood, the response is going to be rapid, and then the solutions are going to be found and implemented in order to mitigate the issue. I'd like to finish my talk by just summarizing what I've just said. For me, the main driver of the landscape change is going to be, and is going to stay, agriculture. That is going to be the same for the next decades or centuries. Intensification is one thing to produce enough yield and then to fill the yield gap, but this is going to be not enough in order to meet the demands of growing population, but also a more affluent population, and it's going to be consuming more. We'll have a biggest impact. When you consider all the non-agricultural commodities that are going also to be needed, as I mentioned, it could be timber or the communities, or even carbon projects that just want to leave some carbon on the ground to mitigate climate change. These are going to have more and more conflicting objectives that you need to combine into sometimes one single project. And all these aspects of intensification and expansion of land will may contribute to worsening environmental outcomes of the landscape that you are going to work on. So considering that the degree to which agriculture is constrained by measures to maintain the environmental values you want to keep is going to happen at a landscape level, global scale level, or international level. And you have to be aware that within this landscape level, agricultural objectives and environmental objectives are going to interact, are going to compete, but you will have to find a trade-off and a compromise in order to reach the objectives that you have set at the beginning of the project. Thank you very much for this question. Indeed, the locust plague is something which is very serious. It happens frequently, regularly, every X years. It depends because actually the locusts can stay in the ground for many years and then suddenly they just come out at the same time. So there are different ways to address that. The first thing is that monocultures are it's not only for the locust, it could be also for other pests that you can find in different parts of the world that feed on one single monoculture crops, because basically the more food you would produce that is going to be the main food for a pest, the larger quantities of individuals of these pests are going to be. They will just have more food, so they will have more babies, so they will have a bigger population, and so on. So one of the responsible for that is to switch the model of huge monoculture plantations into fragmented, mosaic, and diverse kind of crops, so that you don't give as much food as one pest, so that its population is going to explode, and in 1 year just to eat everything, and then you will end up having zero in your field. But if you had planned again in a landscape approach, different kind of yields with different kind of maybe harvesting time, maybe not everything, let's say from April to June, the harvesting time, but more spread throughout the year. When the locusts are going to arrive, they won't find all the food they want because they will have less, but also your food also would be produced a little bit before and a little bit later, so that it doesn't coincide with the explosion and the swarming of the locust. So I think the answer to that is to have a landscape approach, so you don't have everything. You don't have a monoculture first. You don't have everything put in the same place because you have different kind of vegetation, but also your yielding time is going to be throughout the year, so you still be able to have overall throughout the year enough food, and not all your food is going to be ruined in a single event because it would have coincided with the explosion, the swarming of the locust, and the harvesting time of your crop. So this is up to the local governments. Well, it could be first the national governments, but mainly the local governments, to decide on how to reduce the risk of having our yields to be devastated by the crops, by the locusts. And this should be a landscape approach and a planning and a selection of the species, selection of the crops. If there are new crops that the farmers or the local communities don't know how to grow or cannot find the seed because it's not available or because it's too expensive, they need to be supported by the local governments so that they can access those seeds, they can access those genetic resources for free or for a cheap price, so that they can switch and transition their model from a monoculture to something that will be more resilient to this kind of pests, but also will be more resilient to climate change in general, because having a multiple approach, a multiple source of crops, agri-foods, is also a much better way to adapt to the different climate change effects that you can see, not only in Africa, but worldwide. It's completely true, because what they see is a fast return on investment and an opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost is something like tomorrow, let's say if tomorrow I go and see a charcoal producer that his job is to cut down trees and produce charcoal, and he knows he's going to get 1,000 euros for X tons of charcoal. If tomorrow I tell him, okay, you're going to switch and you are going to stop cutting trees and making charcoal, but instead you are going to harvest the nuts and harvest the fruits and harvest the sap from the trees that you are going to sell. The opportunity cost, it means that the cost it will incur for not having the opportunity to produce charcoal is going to be extremely high. So he's going to tell me there is no way, because I will lose money and I will not be able to feed my family if from one day I'm going to switch from charcoal production to producing NTFPs. So the solution is that the transition or the support from the local government has to be put in place, so that downstream you would have already all the supply chain ready that can very quickly transform your NTFP, maybe in an end product, if it has to be wrapped up or if it has to be sold in a special way. Access to market, you need to publicize, you need to make people aware of your product in market or even online, if you can access the online market, or you can also export it to big companies, pharmaceutical, cosmetic companies, so that it can be sold. But unless this supply chain, let's say the downstream of the supply chain is not ready, you won't be able to convince someone to say, hey, if you start producing that, you may be able to get your shea butter, your argan oil, and you will get some money. So it's really up to the institutions to create those supply chains and to convince that it's going to be a very smooth transition, so that as soon as the raw material, it could be the nut of the argan oil or the shea butter, or it could be the baobab nut, as soon as the raw material is collected, it's going to be very easy for the harvester, for, let's say, the charcoal producer that wants to change his life, to sell that, because he knows he will get a certain amount, because he knows behind there will be the supply chain is going to transform that, and he will get his money. But if there is an uncertainty, and the charcoal producer may say, but I'm not sure that I will be able to sell those and get a little bit of money, or as much money as I get by selling charcoal, they are not going to switch. They are not going to transition. So that's very important. And the second thing, which is very important, is that, as I mentioned, the nuts or the fruits or the sap must be here. It means that the trees must be mature enough. So you may decide to plant in the Great Green Wall project or in another project those trees, but they will get to maturity in 10 years only. So what do you do in 10 years? If you want someone to switch already and not wait 10 years, you need to find alternatives, alternative jobs, alternative livelihoods, switch from their unsustainable way of production, let's say charcoal, to something else. But this is, again, money, financing, huge donors like the World Bank, the GIZ, USAID or EU funds needs to come to make sure and chip in and make sure that there is an alternative and a transition, that while those trees are going and before they are going to produce those seeds, an alternative livelihoods can be found. Otherwise, those activities, those unsustainable activities like charcoal production will not stop. So it's a huge task from the institutions, financing branches, financing arms, and also capacity building, supply chain productions, and companies as well that can do an effort, because at the end of the day, when you look at the very nice argan oil or shea butter that are used by cosmetics, that are sold at a high price in Europe, for example, if you go to a shop, this is actually very expensive. The companies also can contribute to producing the infrastructures to produce the supply chain. So it could be an oil press in a village, if they want to press the oil, if they want to produce argan oil in a more in bigger quantities, let's say. Companies could also contribute to that, to deliver presses, to buy the equipment that is needed by the local communities, so that they get their return and they get the return of the investment for farming the land in a special way, and for using the time of collecting the nuts, and then they get their return very quickly, so because the material and the equipment is already bought and is already provided. That could be by companies. It's actually a very relevant question, because fire is the problem number one that I have to deal with in my project, because fire is so easy to set up. Fire can be huge, not only for the trees that I'm trying to plant, but also with all the consequences it can have for biodiversity, wildlife in general. The way to combat fire is there are different approaches. One approach that is already, let's say, too late, is that if there is a fire going on, we would encourage or hire the local communities and pay the local communities to establish squads, establish patrols, so that during the dry season only, it's not very much relevant during the wet season, because you can't really burn anything during the wet season, it's too wet. But during the dry season, it's about 6 to 7 months per year, you would establish patrols which are paid for by the projects, by the company. There are committees that come from the local communities, and then they will just patrol the area. And as soon they would be equipped with fire extinguishers, and then as soon as they see anything, they will just put out the fire, and they will have a sort of radio system and coordination that they can talk to each other to see where they need to get to. So that's what we call a fire rapid response, so that we can try to minimize the fire as soon as possible, because fires, as I mentioned before, are set up by farmers that want to basically farm the land, and then they are going to burn and then plant later. They are going to be also started by cattle guards, because the cattle shepherds, they want to have nice and new sprouts of herbs, tender herbs and herbaceous species for the cattle. So as soon as the fire has spread, you have those new shoots which are very tasty for the cattle. So you also have fire set up by those people. But as I mentioned, this is already too late, because you don't want the fire to happen in the first place. The other thing that you can do before, and then again, it's really about information and about awareness raising, is first of all to use some of the species that are fire resistant. So some of the species are more or less adapted to fire and will more or less resist some fire. So you may choose some of the species because you know that you will have at some point some fires, and you want to have as less as possible loss in your trees. So that's something that you can anticipate beforehand in the planning of your project. But I think the most important thing that you need to do while you are preventing fire is actually what we just talked before, is that if communities think they own the forest resource because they will get the benefits from the resource, from the forest resource, because they will get, let's say, NTFPs from the resource, they will not want to set fire, because they know that if they burn it down, they will burn down their livelihood, and then they will burn down basically their quality of life. So what you need to do is convince them that, and it's not simple, that fire is actually not wanted, because if they have the right species, they grow, and then they own those species because they depend on them, they will not want to set the fires in the first place. And that is the most important thing you need to do upstream. It takes a long time. It needs a lot of decision, as I mentioned before. But for me, the not having a fire in the first place is the most important. And I'm trying to work towards this way with the local communities. Results varies a lot. Sometimes they do engage in the process. Sometimes they just want to keep their activities of charcoal or of farming, unsustainable farming practices. But it's really a case-by-case situation. But we have these elements or these solutions that we try to implement, so that we try to reduce that risk as much as possible. It's true that if everything comes in a whole project and with a lot of deliverables and objectives, they may be put off by the project. So the planning is very important, and they also must see the benefits regularly. We cannot just say you will get something in 5 years. It's just too far, or you will get everything in 5 years. They need to have quick return. So you need to establish in a timeline, and that's very much in the project setup, those clear milestones, those clear deadlines along a timeline that they understand, so that there is no surprise, like why didn't I get that thing in January and I was expecting that thing. It has to be very clearly understood, and all those deliverables are widespread, are stretched across the whole period, so that both of their income, both of their benefits will be stretched across a timeline, but also their involvement will be stretched across a specific timeline. So they will know that their activities, let's say for tree planting or for tree maintenance or for nut collecting, will be a month there, a month there, a month there. So they perfectly know that their time will be used according to the needs, and then the return, it means their the payment, the benefits will also be delivered according to this time window. But that's very much true for all the project setups that you want to develop with communities. You have to be very clear at the beginning when you engage with them about what is going to be in terms of benefits and also about time from their side.